Robert Schock, a 39-year-old ultra-runner from Washington State, stepped onto the Hannigan Pass trailhead on July 31, 2024, with his chocolate Labrador named Freddie, a small backpack, and a plan to finish a 20-mile run before dark. He carried no food, no overnight gear, no compass, and no real understanding of how drastically wildfire had reshaped the terrain he thought he knew. 30 days later, searchers would find him barely alive on the banks of the Chilliwack River, naked and skeletal, having survived the longest recorded disappearance in North Cascades history without supplies. Schock was not what most people imagine when they think of a hiker. He was an ultra-marathon runner by inclination, a musician by trade, and a wanderer by temperament. He moved through the Pacific Northwest the way certain restless people do, ours without permanent addresses or 5-year plans, renting rooms for a few months before drifting to the next temporary home. Sometimes he slept in his car. Sometimes he did not know where he would be next week. Music provided income when he needed it. A guitar and voice exchanged for tips under bar lights or on street corners. It was not a glamorous existence, but it was his, and he had made peace with its impermanence. His mother, Jan Thompson, who lived in North Carolina, described her son as a loner with a warm heart, someone who insisted on freedom even when that freedom made him difficult to locate or predict. He was restless, difficult to pin down, generous in flashes, stubborn in the deep places where stubbornness becomes identity. There was one steady point in Schock's roaming life, and it trotted beside him at the trailhead that morning. Freddie, a 5-year-old chocolate Labrador with the thick, athletic build that comes from living outdoors and the uncritical devotion that makes dogs both beloved and vulnerable. Freddie ran with Schock the way he did everything else, fully and without question. He did not understand risk. He understood togetherness. The bond between them was simple and absolute. Where Schock went, Freddie followed. On that morning in late July, Schock parked his vehicle at the Hannigan Pass trailhead just outside North Cascades National Park and prepared for what he believed would be a straightforward day run. His approach to wilderness travel was minimalist, bordering on dismissive of the idea that nature required planning. He was not a backpacker. He had no interest in the slow accumulation of gear that makes many hikers feel safe. His runs were meant to be swift and simple. Start early, cover distance, return by evening. That morning, his small backpack contained only a folding bowl for Freddie and an old paper map with markings from past outings. No food, no spare clothes, no compass, no fire starter, no emergency supplies. His phone was fully charged, but in these mountains, phones are less a tool than a comfort object. The signal disappears not far from the trailhead, swallowed by rock and forest. Schock rolled the windows of his car halfway down and left his wallet sitting on the dashboard. His guitar, something he rarely let out of his sight, stayed in the trunk. Anyone familiar with missing person cases will recognize this detail for what it is: the accidental evidence of intention. People who expect to return soon leave things the way Schock left them. They do not secure valuables. They do not prepare their vehicle. They do not behave as though absence is possible. The North Cascades rise along the Canadian border in northwestern Washington, a sprawling wilderness of jagged peaks carved by ancient glaciers, deep valleys thick with temperate rainforest, and rivers fed by snowmelt that runs cold even in summer. The range receives more than 100 inches of precipitation annually in some areas. It is a place of moss-covered giants and perpetual moisture, where fog rolls through valleys without warning and visibility can drop to nothing in minutes. The terrain punishes navigational errors with swift brutality. Trails can vanish under fallen timber. Weather systems collide against the mountains and produce storms that arrive with almost no notice. The forest floor is a tangle of ferns, devil's club with thorns like needles and downed logs rotting back into soil. It is beautiful in the way that indifferent things can be beautiful. It does not care whether you prepared correctly. It simply waits. The Chilliwack River, which would eventually become both Shock's lifeline and his prison, carves through the heart of this wilderness with glacial power. The water runs cloudy with suspended sediment, cold enough to induce hypothermia in minutes, loud enough to swallow human voices at 50 feet. Along its banks, gravel bars shift with each flood, creating temporary beaches that vanish when winter storms arrive. The river is an authority that cannot be reasoned with. It takes what falls into it. It offers water, but demands respect. The first 7 miles unfolded without incident. The Chilliwack River Trail followed the water through stands of cedar and Douglas fir, the air wet with that deep green smell the Cascades produce, rot and life braided together in the endless cycle of growth and decay. Freddie ran ahead, doubled back, then ran ahead again in the tireless loop of happy dogs. The river roared somewhere below, cold and constant. Around midday, Shock passed a young couple hiking back toward the trailhead. They exchanged a few words about the weather and the season. The couple continued downward. Shock continued up, because they were the last people to see him upright and moving with purpose. 7 miles in, Shock reached a cable car, a simple suspended transport mechanism that allowed hikers to cross the Chilliwack River without wading through its icy, powerful current. He pulled himself across to the east bank and stepped into terrain that no longer matched his memory. The Bear Creek Fire of 2021 and the Chilliwack Complex fires of 2022 had burned tens of thousands of acres in this part of the range, forcing the long-term closure of the eastern portion of the trail. Fire changes everything that follows it. Roots die, soil loosens, trails erode, winter storms topple weakened trunks, and new vegetation explodes in the ash-enriched soil. What had been a clean corridor of packed dirt becomes a puzzle of fallen timber, impenetrable brush, and vanished tread. And in places, the path disappears entirely beneath the chaos of post-fire regeneration. Shock had been through this area before, but not since the fires. He noticed the charred stands and ash underfoot, the blackened trunks rising like burnt fingers against the sky. But he did what people often do when they want the day to stay simple. He treated the information as background noise. He came across a trail sign that seemed to direct him toward the international border, less than 20 miles away. But the sign appeared to point south, which made no sense given his mental map. His phone's GPS proved useless. No service, no signal, just a glowing screen that promised connectivity it could not deliver. But he had come this far, and backtracking meant admitting defeat, meant repeating the miles he had already covered, and meant acknowledging that his plan had failed. So he kept moving, reasoning that the trail would reappear just beyond the next ridge, that clarity was always one more effort away. This logic, common and seductive and often fatal, is a version of sunk cost fallacy. You have already fought through the worst of it, you tell yourself. It would be stupid to give up now. Better to keep going. The trail has to come back. But the trail did not come back. It had been erased or rerouted or destroyed by fire and flood, and Shock continued searching for it as though the land owed him continuity, as though his familiarity with the area 2 years ago meant anything to the forest now. At some point during that first day, thirsty and overheated from the run, Shock descended to the river to drink and cool his feet. But he removed his running shoes to let them dry after they got soaked crossing a small tributary. The current, stronger than it looked and deceptive in the way mountain water always is, swept both shoes downstream before he could react. He watched them disappear into white water, already too far gone to chase, bobbing once and then vanishing around a bend. He stared at the empty space where they had been. He was now barefoot in wilderness terrain that included sharp gravel, thorns, fallen branches with splintered ends, and exposed roots that could slice skin like wire. Every step from that moment forward would cost him. By the time he admitted the truth, that the familiar route existed now only in memory, and that he was genuinely lost in terrain he no longer recognized, dusk had begun to bleed through the trees. The light took on that flat, directionless quality that precedes true darkness. Night in wet forest is not dramatic. It is simply hard. Shock stopped under thick cedar branches and waited, shivering in damp clothing, trying to keep Freddie close for warmth. He had no fire. He had no dry layer to change into. He had no shelter beyond the indifferent protection of branches that leaked cold mist onto his shoulders. He waited for dawn, with the kind of hope people summon when hope is the only thing left that costs nothing. Morning arrived with fog, milky and thick, hanging between trunks like cloth suspended in the air. The sky was a flat gray lid without variation, offering no clue to direction. Shock stood stiff and cold and tried to orient himself using landmarks he thought he remembered. In open country, you can use the sun to navigate. In this forest, right beneath this canopy and fog, the sun is an idea, not a tool. He checked his phone. Overnight cold had drained the battery to the edge of dead. On the second day, his phone finally died. There was no signal anyway, but its death felt symbolic, the severing of his last tenuous connection to the world beyond the trees. Shock's instincts, honed by years of running in wilderness, kicked in immediately. He took inventory of what he had: a small backpack, a folding dog bowl, a paper map that showed trails no longer passable, his shorts and a thin shirt, both damp. That was everything. He pored over the map, trying to match terrain features to the ridges and valleys around him, but post-fire landscape renders maps obsolete. The landmarks had changed. He made a decision. He would head north toward Canada. And the international border was roughly 20 miles away, according to the sign he had seen. Surely, he reasoned, there would be roads or people or some sign of civilization near the border. It was a logical plan. It was also based on a sign that may have been damaged or turned by falling trees, pointing him in exactly the wrong direction. For the next day and a half, Shock pushed north, or what he believed was north, tramping through undergrowth, climbing over fallen timber, descending steep slopes on bare feet that quickly became torn and bloody. Freddie followed, panting and confused, his paws growing sore from the rough terrain. The forest offered nothing. No other hikers. No sounds of civilization. Just the constant background roar of the river and the silence of trees. It was on the third day that Shock's discovery adventure turned into a survival attempt. He had a puncture wound in his big toe from a thorn, and the injury was beginning to show signs of infection, red and swollen and hot to the touch. He was growing increasingly disoriented. Hunger, which had been manageable as a dull ache, was now a constant presence. He had not eaten in 3 days. The scattered bushes clinging to the hillside provided only a few sour berries that made his mouth pucker and offered almost no calories. His body was beginning to consume itself. By the third day, beside the river, Shock made the decision that would later sound like something out of a survival film and feel in the moment like a moral injury. He looked at Freddie, wet fur clumped, body trembling, paws bleeding, and realized the dog's loyalty was now a threat to both of them. Freddie could not survive weeks of cold nights and long miles without food. Dogs are resilient, but they are not equipped for prolonged starvation. Shock also understood, dimly at first, and then with sharpened clarity, that Freddie had a chance he did not. The ability to navigate by instinct, to retrace a scent trail, to find humans. Freddy carried a microchip. Freddy could become a message, a signal that something had gone wrong. But Labradors do not leave their people. Loyalty is bred into them at a cellular level. Freddy would not run off simply because Shock told him to. So Shock did something cruel with intention. He turned himself into a threat. He shouted in a harsh voice, a tone he had never used with the dog before. He advanced aggressively, yelling and waving his arms, making himself large and terrifying. He picked up a stick and struck the water in front of Freddy's nose, splashing icy river water into the dog's face. Fear finally overtook devotion. Freddy backed away, ears flat, tail tucked, confused by this sudden transformation of his person into something dangerous. Then he ran. The dog stopped more than once, looking back, whining, torn between fear and the desperate desire to return. Shock kept shouting, kept advancing, until the brown body vanished into green undergrowth. Then he dropped the stick and sank to his knees on the rocky shore. The silence after that effort was immense. He had saved the dog by betraying it. He was now alone in the mountains in the most complete way a person can be alone. Not merely without other humans, but without the one living creature who had shared his days, who had looked at him with uncomplicated love. Freddy traveled roughly 8 miles over the next day, driven by hunger and the memory of the trailhead. He reached the main trail along the river and was found by hikers on August 3rd. The hikers noticed him circling near the trail, refusing to move on, whining and looking back toward the forest as if the trees contained an answer he desperately needed. They recognized something wrong in the dog's behavior. This was not a lost pet wandering aimlessly. This was a dog waiting for someone who was not coming. They brought him to the nearest ranger station. A microchip scan produced a name, Robert Shock, with a temporary address in Mount Vernon, Washington. On August 4th, where Jan Thompson received a phone call from the Whatcom Humane Society in Washington State. They told her that her son's dog had been found on a trail near the Chilliwack River. Thompson had not known her son planned to run in the North Cascades. The freedom he insisted upon included freedom from notifying anyone where he was going. She had tried calling him on July 31st, the day he went missing, without success. Now, days later, a stranger was telling her that Freddy had been found alone. The implication hung in the air, unspoken but understood. On August 5th, sheriff's deputies located Shock's car at the Hannigan Pass trailhead, untouched and exactly where he had left it 5 days earlier. The windows were halfway down. The wallet lay open on the dashboard. The guitar sat in the trunk like a quiet accusation. When the deputy who examined the scene called Thompson, he told her gently that the condition of the vehicle suggested her son had gone into the wilderness with no intention of coming out. Thompson rejected this immediately. She knew her son. He was restless, yes. He was a wanderer. But he was not suicidal. He had simply been careless, as he had been before. Thompson filed the missing person report that day, and the search began. From the outside, search operations look heroic. Helicopters with thermal imaging, teams with trained tracking dogs, volunteers combing through wilderness in organized grids. From the inside, search operations are grim logistics and probability calculations. The terrain dictates the limits of what is possible. In the North Cascades, dense canopy blocks thermal imaging cameras, and the thick layer of leaves and branches makes heat signatures invisible from above. Rivers create dead zones for sound. A person can scream for help 50 feet from a trail and be completely inaudible over the roar of water. Steep slopes fracture radio communication. Fog and rain, which are constant in this region, reduce visibility to near nothing. Even when you fly overhead in perfect conditions, the forest is a green dome, unbroken and impenetrable. and a person beneath it is invisible. For 2 weeks, rescuers worked through the logical routes, the places a lost runner might go, the ridges that funnel toward trails, the river corridors that offer water and theoretical navigation. Whatcom County Sheriff's Office deputies and North Cascades National Park Rangers performed detailed ground searches on 3 separate days in August, covering miles of trail and bushwhacking into areas where someone might have wandered off path. On August 16th, U.S. Border Patrol flew over Chilliwack Basin in a helicopter and conducted another ground sweep, looking for any signs of shock. Clothing, footprints, disturbed vegetation, anything. They found nothing. At one point, a ground team passed less than a mile from where Shock was hiding, but the brush was too thick, forming impenetrable walls of alder and devil's club. The river too loud, creating a curtain of white noise, and Shock's voice too weak to carry. Helicopters flew over the area twice during the first 2 weeks. Shock heard the rotors, that distinctive thump, thump, thump cutting through the forest ambiance. He saw shadows flicker through gaps in leaves. He screamed until his throat felt torn, waving his arms frantically at the sky, jumping despite the pain in his feet. No one saw him. The forest canopy was too thick. His movement was invisible beneath the green. The machine's noise moved on, the sound fading into distance. The forest closed again. The silence returned. By August 20th, after 16 days of intensive searching, the official search was suspended. This was not a moral decision, though it felt like one to the family. It was a risk calculation based on probability and resource allocation. Continuing to send rescuers into steep, storm-soaked terrain without new information, without any sign that Shock was still in the area or still alive, threatened more lives. What the statistical odds of finding an adult alive after more than 2 weeks without food or shelter in wilderness conditions were low enough to sound like cruelty when spoken aloud by officials. But the numbers were the numbers. Thompson did not accept the conclusion. She called her son every morning, leaving messages on a dead phone, repeating that he was a fighter, that she loved him, that he needed to hold on. The repetition was half prayer, half denial, and entirely human. She posted on social media. She contacted local news. She refused to believe that silence meant finality. Meanwhile, unaware that the official search had ended, unaware that his mother was leaving daily voicemails on a phone with a dead battery lying somewhere in his abandoned backpack, Robert Shock was doing what lost people do when they do not have an anchor point. But he kept moving. He followed the river downstream because water is at least a line in the chaos, a feature that goes somewhere even if you do not know where. He drank from the Chilliwack constantly, descending to the rocky shore multiple times each day, dipping his hands and face into the flow, letting the icy shock keep him alert. The water was murky with glacial silt, gray-white and opaque, cold enough to burn his throat going down. He knew that untreated river water carried risks. Giardia, bacteria, parasites. But dehydration kills quickly, and the river offered no alternative. He drank and accepted the consequences. Food came in small, unreliable forms that barely qualified as nourishment. Berries by the handful, bitter and sour, clinging to bushes in the burn zones where sunlight had penetrated after the fires. But he ate them despite the taste, his mouth puckering, knowing that calories were calories. Leaves chewed and spat when they proved too bitter or tough. One day, perhaps the 4th or 5th, he found a large mushroom, thick and pale and growing at the base of a burned stump. He stared at it for a long time. Eating an unidentified mushroom in the wilderness is a gamble with poisoning, with organ failure, with a death more painful than starvation. But hunger overrode caution. He broke off a piece and ate it slowly, tasting for bitterness or the metallic tang that sometimes indicates toxicity. It tasted ordinary, almost bland, like something you would find on a pizza or in a pasta dish. The texture was firm, slightly chewy. The fact that it did not kill him felt like luck on a scale, out of proportion to the event. But he ate the entire mushroom throughout that day, rationing pieces, and it gave him enough energy to change his plan. The north was clearly not working. He turned south, attempting to retrace his steps toward the trailhead he had left days earlier. But by then, every ridge looked the same. Every valley felt identical. The forest had become a repeating pattern without variation. He tried to make fire. This is the advice given in every survival manual. Fire provides warmth, can purify water, signals rescuers, offers psychological comfort. But fire requires materials Shock did not have. Without a knife, he could not shave tinder from dry wood. Without dry wood, which did not exist in this perpetually damp environment, he had nothing to burn. Without a fire starter, matches, or even glasses to focus sunlight, he had no ignition source. Fire remained theoretical, a concept that belonged to people with tools. He found shelter under fallen trunks and in root hollows that smelled of old animal scat and damp soil. At night, he curled into the smallest shape possible, trying to conserve heat. He slept in shivering fragments, never more than an hour at a time, hyperventilating through the darkness to generate warmth through rapid breathing. The technique worked, barely. He woke stiff, his muscles cramped, his joints aching. He moved again because movement was the only alternative to lying still and dying. Days 5 through 10 became a blur of repetition. Walk, drink, search for food, rest, repeat. The puncture wound in his big toe, which had started as a sharp pain, was now infected, the skin around it red and swollen, radiating heat. Each step sent pain shooting up his leg. His other foot was cut in dozens of places from sharp rocks and thorns. Walking barefoot on gravel became an exercise in controlled agony. Around day 7, Shock heard a sound that did not belong to the forest. A chainsaw buzzing in the distance, the mechanical whine cutting through natural ambience. He ran toward it, ignoring the pain, crashing through brush, yelling for help. The sound stopped. He kept moving in the direction he thought it had come from. The sound did not return. He never found the source. It may have been a logging crew miles away, the sound carrying strangely through the valleys. It may have been auditory hallucination, his brain manufacturing hope from nothing. Time lost structure. Days merged into a single long sequence of hunger, cold, and movement. He began to lose track of which day it was. Had it been a week? More 10 days? He was not sure. He began to hallucinate in the mild, creeping way starvation produces. Not dramatic visions, but subtle distortions. He heard voices in the river, words buried in white noise. He caught glimpses of figures between trees, shadows that moved like people, and then resolved into stumps or branches when he looked directly at them. He talked aloud to himself, reciting song lyrics he had written, fragments of conversations with his mother, anything to fill the silence. The sound of his own voice became a companion. Freddie returned again and again in his mind, a shadow at the edge of vision, a phantom bark echoing through the trees. Shock spoke to the dog as if it could hear him across the miles. He apologized for the cruelty. He explained why it had been necessary. He hoped, desperately, that Freddie had made it out, or that someone had found him, that the microchip had been scanned and his mother notified. The dog became a mental anchor, proof that he had made at least one correct decision. Hunger became a constant physical presence, no longer a sensation that came and went with mealtimes, but an ache that lived inside his ribs and never left. His body began to dismantle itself, consuming fat reserves first, and then moving to muscle. The transformation happened faster than he expected. His face hollowed. His ribs began to show through his shirt. His joints hurt in new ways, bone grinding against bone without enough cushioning tissue. Every movement demanded more will than it should have. The simple act of standing required a decision, a conscious choice to overcome the exhaustion that pulled him toward the ground. The river kept roaring beside him, unchanging, indifferent to his suffering. Sometimes that constancy comforted him. It was a presence, at least, something that continued regardless of whether he lived or died. More often it felt like mockery, nature insisting on continuity while his own body decayed hour by hour. On what he believed was the 18th or 19th day, though he was no longer certain of his count, Shock attempted another river crossing. He had spotted berries on the opposite bank, a thick cluster that might provide a full meal's worth of calories. Hunger drives people toward bad trades, toward risks that look acceptable in the moment and catastrophic in hindsight. He waded into the current, feeling for purchase on slick rocks beneath the gray water. The current caught him midstream, stronger than he expected, and swept him off his feet. Yet he was pulled downstream, tumbling in the icy water, unable to get his feet under him. He slammed into a granite boulder with the full force of the current behind him. The impact knocked the air out of his lungs. He surfaced downstream, coughing and choking, lungs burning, and crawled onto a gravel bar with pain radiating from his heel. Something had failed. His Achilles tendon, already stressed by weeks of barefoot walking on uneven terrain, by malnutrition that weakened connective tissue, had either torn or inflamed to the point of uselessness. He tried to stand. His left leg would not support his weight. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. He collapsed back onto the gravel. In the days that followed, Shock's world reduced again, from miles to yards. He could not walk. He could move only by crawling, but dragging himself forward on his forearms like a wounded animal. Even crawling was exhausting. He made it perhaps 50 yards in an hour before exhaustion forced him to stop. He found a spot on a narrow gravel shore, hidden behind a thick alder thicket, and he stopped moving. This was where he would either be found or die. The maintained trail ran less than a mile away, just beyond the wall of brush, but between trail and riverbank, the alder and devil's club grew in impenetrable tangles. Sound from the water created a white noise barrier that swallowed everything quieter than a shout. Shock was effectively invisible and inaudible to anyone on the trail. He took stock of what remained. His shorts, torn and filthy. His shirt, damp and providing no warmth. His small backpack, which he now used as a pillow. That was everything. But he had no tools, no ability to move, no realistic hope of self-rescue. Dysentery arrived, likely from weeks of drinking untreated river water. His body, already weakened, lost control of basic functions. He soiled himself repeatedly, unable to move far enough away from his shelter spot. The humiliation was almost worse than the physical discomfort. This was not how survival was supposed to look. There was no dignity here, no heroic endurance. Just the slow, degrading collapse of a human body pushed beyond its limits. His skin burned under brief sun breaks when the clouds parted. Without the protection of the forest canopy, direct sunlight blistered his already damaged skin. His legs swelled from infection, the tissue puffy and discolored. He had lost close to 50 pounds by this point, his body consuming itself to stay alive. He looked, or in the accounts of those who found him, like a concentration camp survivor, like a person already halfway to death. Each day developed a grim routine. Morning arrived with cold, his body shivering violently until the sun rose high enough to provide faint warmth through the canopy. By 1:30 in the afternoon, if the weather was clear, sun would strike the gravel bar directly for perhaps an hour. This was the best part of his day. He would lie in the sunlight, absorbing warmth, basking like a reptile, feeling the heat penetrate his skin. He fantasized during these moments, elaborate daydreams about food, burgers dripping with grease, French fries salted and crispy, pizza loaded with toppings. The fantasies were so vivid he could almost taste them, almost feel the satisfaction of a full stomach. Or then the sun would move behind the ridge, and the cold would return. He spent hours each day at the river's edge, drinking constantly, trying to stay ahead of dehydration. The water tasted of rock and glacier, mineral and cold. He sometimes filled his folding dog bowl, the only item he still possessed beyond the backpack, and drank from it like Freddie used to, the memory bringing tears. At night, he used his backpack as his only shield against the biting cold. He would drape it over his torso, curl into the smallest possible shape, and hyperventilate for hours, the rapid breathing generating just enough warmth to prevent hypothermia. He never slept through the night. Sleep came in fragments, 20-minute intervals before cold or pain woke him. Storms rolled through periodically, drenching him with icy sheets of rain that soaked through everything and dropped his body temperature dangerously low. On those nights, survival became a minute-by-minute effort, a constant battle to stay conscious and keep breathing. He screamed for help every day, multiple times, whenever he had the strength. His voice, already weakened by malnutrition, barely carried above the river's roar. No one answered. The forest absorbed his voice and gave nothing back. Around day 23, Shock heard the helicopter again. The distinctive sound of rotors appeared suddenly, growing louder directly overhead. This was different from before. This was close. He screamed with everything he had left, a raw animal sound torn from a throat damaged by weeks of shouting. He waved his arms, the movement sending pain through his emaciated frame. As the helicopter hovered for perhaps 30 seconds. Then it moved on. The sound faded. He lay back on the gravel and wept. They had been right there, right above him, and they had seen nothing. The canopy was too thick. He was invisible. The false hope pattern repeated days later. On what might have been day 26 or 27, he heard voices, human voices, conversation and laughter coming from somewhere nearby. He gathered his strength and screamed. The voices stopped. He screamed again, a hoarse, desperate sound. Silence. Then the voices resumed, moving away, fading into distance. They had been hikers on the main trail, just beyond the brush, and they had either not heard him or mistaken his voice for an animal sound. The near miss devastated him more than the helicopter. They had been so close, walking distance, and they had walked past. By then, hope had become something thin and almost embarrassing, a childish belief he clung to despite all evidence. People talk about survival as though it is fueled by determination, as though willpower is a resource you can choose to spend. In reality, survival often becomes mechanical. You keep breathing because you are breathing. You keep waking because you woke. The conscious mind, the part that makes decisions and plans, recedes. What remains is something more primitive, a biological imperative that refuses to stop. Some part of Shock wanted to die. The thought came frequently, especially at night when shivering shook his muscles into cramps, and the river's roar became the only voice in the world. It would be easy to lie down and let cold finish the work. No more pain, no more hunger, no more uncertainty. You just sleep, the long kind that doesn't end. What kept him alive, by his later account, was not heroism or unusual strength. It was attachment. His mother's face appearing in his mind, the knowledge that Freddie had escaped, the irrational hope that someone might still be looking, even if logic said otherwise. Those thoughts were not reasonable, but survival rarely is. On August 30th, nearly a month after Shock had stepped onto the trail with Freddie and a small backpack, a group of young seasonal workers with the Pacific Northwest Trail Association were returning to their camp after a grueling 10-hour day. They had been hauling materials and re-establishing trail tread using only hand tools, exhausting work in difficult terrain. They walked along the maintained trail near the Chilliwack River, talking among themselves, or thinking about camp and food and sleep. Their bodies hurt. They were ready to be done. One of them, a young man named Miles Cottingham, separated slightly from the group and paused near the river. He heard something. Above the river's constant roar, a sound rose that did not belong to wind or water or birds. A faint human voice. "Help." Cottingham stopped walking. He held up a hand, silencing his crew. They all listened. There, again. Weak, hoarse, barely audible. "Help." They dropped their packs and ran toward the water, crashing through the alder thicket, following the sound. On a gravel bar, half hidden among the vegetation, they found what they first mistook for debris. A pale, contorted shape curled in on itself among the rocks. Then the shape moved. Then they understood it was a man. Shock lay naked, but having lost his shorts days earlier when they had finally disintegrated. He was skeletal, every rib visible, skin pulled tight over bone. His beard was matted with dirt and debris. His lips were cracked and bleeding. His eyes looked unfocused, clouded by exhaustion and starvation and something close to delirium. He whispered that he was hallucinating, that they were not real, that they were forest spirits or a pack of wolves come to kill him. His vision was failing, his brain struggling to process what it was seeing. One of the volunteers, a young man whose name Shock would later struggle to remember through the fog of those final hours, took off his shirt and covered him. The gesture, simple and human, broke something inside Shock. He began to cry, tears streaming down his face in a way that seemed less like emotion than involuntary release, the body expressing what the mind could no longer articulate. Another volunteer produced a tortilla smeared with peanut butter and jelly from his pack. They fed Shock small pieces, careful not to overwhelm his stomach, which had shrunk after a month without food. Too much food too quickly can kill a starving person. Shock chewed slowly, the act of swallowing difficult. The taste was overwhelming, almost painful in its intensity. Sweet and salt and fat, flavors his tongue had forgotten. He cried harder. Someone activated a satellite communicator and called for emergency extraction. The crew covered Shock with their jackets, trying to warm his body, which had no fat left to insulate it. They spoke to him gently, telling him he was safe. Boit, that help was coming, that he was going to be okay. Shock drifted in and out of coherence, sometimes responding to questions, sometimes staring through them at nothing. Within an hour, a helicopter appeared overhead, the sound of rotors that Shock had heard twice before and thought would never return for him. This time, it did not fly past. It hovered directly above the gravel bar, rotors blasting sand and water into a whirlwind. Rescuers descended on ropes, moving with practiced efficiency. They assessed Shock's condition: severe malnutrition, dehydration, infected wounds, hypothermia, possible organ damage. They secured him in a stretcher, strapping him down gently, started an intravenous line to begin fluid replacement, and covered him with thermal blankets. And then they lifted him out of the forest he had crawled through for nearly a month, up through the canopy that had hidden him so effectively, and away. Jeff Kish, the executive director of the Pacific Northwest Trail Association, would later write in a Facebook post that there was nothing that could fully prepare anyone to handle the mental and emotional burden of providing aid to someone like Robert under the circumstances they found him in. The trail crew workers, none of them medical professionals, just young people doing seasonal conservation work, had saved his life against improbable odds and at great psychological toll. Several would later report nightmares about what they had seen on that gravel bar. Hospitals reverse starvation with extreme caution. Shock's body, after weeks of consuming itself, it could not simply be refueled like a car with an empty tank. Refeeding syndrome, a potentially fatal condition that occurs when nutrition is reintroduced too quickly to a starving body, was a real risk. Doctors fed him intravenously at first, carefully monitoring electrolyte levels, watching for cardiac complications, avoiding the metabolic shock that can kill people who survive the wilderness only to die from the sudden influx of nutrition. On the fourth day, they gave him broth, the first food by mouth since the volunteers' tortilla. He later described the taste of hot liquid as something close to impossible, a sensation too gentle to belong in a world that had been only cold and hunger and pain. When Jan Thompson entered the hospital ward on September 4th, she did not recognize her son at first. But the person in the bed looked like a stranger wearing Robert's outline, the features familiar but distorted by weight loss and damage. Then he whispered her name, and she knew. She crossed the room and held him carefully, as if he were made of something fragile and expensive that might break under too much pressure. She did not ask questions. There would be time for questions later. For now, she simply held him and cried. A week later, the volunteers who had found Shock visited the hospital. Shock hugged them one by one, repeating that they were angels, that they had saved his life, that he owed them everything. The word angels embarrassed him even as he spoke it. But gratitude has its own vocabulary, and sometimes it reaches for myth because ordinary language feels too small to contain what needs to be expressed. By the end of September, Shock could walk with a cane, his gait unsteady, his damaged Achilles tendon still healing. He regained weight quickly, 40 pounds within a month, his body responding to consistent nutrition with almost desperate efficiency. But tendons remained stiff and painful, and his joints felt older than they should have, damaged by weeks of malnutrition. He had survived, but survival is not a clean victory. It leaves residue, physical scars, psychological wounds, memories that surface at unexpected moments. On October 5th, when Shock's father and stepmother brought him to Ohio, where he had grown up, Freddie met him at the car. The reunion happened exactly as one might hope. Freddie recognized Shock immediately, despite the weight loss and transformation. The dog launched himself forward, a tail wagging so hard his entire body swayed, whining and barking and trying to lick every part of Shock he could reach. Shock dropped to his knees, ignoring the pain, and buried his face in the dog's fur. The reunion, in its simplicity, contained everything the wilderness story did not. Warmth, certainty, forgiveness. There was no judgment in Freddie's eyes, no memory of the moment Shock had driven him away. Only joy, only the uncomplicated happiness of being together again. In the interviews that followed, Shock did not present himself as a conqueror or a hero. If anything, he sounded chastened, humbled by how close he had come to death. He repeated lessons people in the outdoors community have heard so often they become background noise, cliches that everyone acknowledges and many ignore. Always tell someone your route and expected return time. Carry a map and compass and know how to use them. Do not trust memory, especially in terrain that has changed. Do not rely on your phone as your only navigation tool. Pack emergency supplies even for day trips. Bring food. Bring fire-starting equipment. Bring a first aid kit. These warnings are so basic that experienced people tend to treat them as rules for beginners, advice meant for others. That is exactly why they fail. Experience does not cancel risk. It often magnifies it by making you careless, by giving you confidence that is not matched by preparation. Schock admitted that he had placed himself in risky situations before, situations where he had questioned whether he would make it back, and he always had, but usually through luck or the aid of someone who happened to come along at the right moment. He had developed, by his own admission, a cocky attitude about wilderness travel, a belief that he was skilled enough, experienced enough, that the rules did not fully apply to him. This time was different. This time, based on where he was and how long he had been missing, the likelihood of help was almost zero. He had been ready to die out there. He had made peace with it during those final nights when cold seemed certain to finish what hunger had started. When you look closely at what happened to Robert Schock, the story does not hinge on a single catastrophic event. There was no dramatic injury on day one, no avalanche or rock slide, no broken leg on a knife-edge ridge. There was only a series of small decisions that seemed reasonable in the moment. Packing light because he always packed light, and it had always worked before. Trusting a remembered route because it had been passable 2 years earlier. Pushing forward when the trail disappeared because turning back felt like failure and wasted effort. Losing his shoes and continuing anyway because stopping meant admitting he was in serious trouble. Each decision, in isolation, was defensible. In combination, they were fatal. The mountains did not trap him with malice. They simply accepted each decision without comment and allowed the consequences to unfold according to natural law. Cold behaves like cold. Hunger progresses through predictable stages. The forest does not care about your experience or your confidence. It treats everyone with the same indifference. The North Cascades took almost everything from Robert Schock: his shoes, his strength, his dignity, very nearly his life. But they did not take his will to see another morning, even when that will had been reduced to pure biological stubbornness, the body refusing to quit even after the mind had partially surrendered. And in the end, the wilderness offered him a narrow, accidental exit, not because it cared whether he lived, but because a few tired volunteers happened to pause at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right place to hear a voice that should have been impossible to hear above the river's roar. Schock survived not through superior skill or unusual bravery, but through a combination of factors mostly beyond his control. He survived because Freddie made it out and triggered the search. He survived because his body, already lean from running, had reserves to burn. He survived because the weather, though cold and wet, was not the killing cold of winter. He survived because he found that one mushroom that happened to be edible. He survived because infection in his feet and Achilles' tendon, though painful and debilitating, did not turn septic and kill him. He survived because the trail crew happened to be working in that remote section of trail on that specific day. Remove any one of those factors, and he dies on that gravel bar. Survival, in this case, was not heroism. It was persistence when all agency had been stripped away. It was enduring not because you are strong, but because stopping means dying. Or when some stubborn part of you refuses to let that be the final word. It was humiliation and degradation and a month of suffering that stripped away every pretense of human dignity. And at the end, it was the kindness of strangers who gave their shirts and their food and their time to a naked, skeletal man they had never met and would likely never see again. If this story challenged you, made you rethink how easily confidence can become carelessness in the wilderness, please take a moment to like the video. It really helps the channel reach more people. And if you want more true stories of survival, endurance, and the thin line between life and death in the wild, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next story.